Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah.
My name is Logan Lynn. I'm the Public Relations and Innovations Manager here at Q Center.
I'm Tim Smith, and I am the lead pastor of Mars Hill Church in Portland. So in 2011, I began the process of shifting from being a worship pastor, leading a lot of music and production and arts and such at our Mars Hill churches in and around the greater Seattle area. I shifted from that towards moving back to my hometown of Portland, Oregon, to plant a Mars Hill church here. And to make a long story short, we did that a lot kind of behind the scenes, just folks in relationship with one another in homes, and then gradually that took on a series of periodic gatherings, and then eventually we started looking for a place to meet. And we figured that it would be primarily a setup, tear down, leased or rented kind of space, because that's usually how we start churches. But we found this beautiful space in southeast Portland, tucked away in the Sunnyside neighborhood that looked like a castle. We call it the Castle. And it was a gorgeous building that was exactly what I had hoped and prayed for in a facility to launch a church in. And it was at a price that we could actually afford. And so even though we weren't expecting to, we entered into the process of buying that facility.
So Mars Hill purchased a building over in deep southeast Portland, and news broke pretty fast within the greater community and certainly within the queer community. The tagline initially was a quote from Mark Driscoll, who is sort of the most well-known Mars Hill church person. He's written many books, and he equates homosexuality as a cancer on our society, as well as a bunch of other sort of anti-gay statements, frankly. So, you know, our defenses were, I think the community of Portland reacted defensively to this church coming in, and rightfully so. I mean, part of when the Oregonian, just because of my job here at Q Center as the Public Relations and Innovations Manager, press and when different things happen in town, certainly queer things, I get called first for a statement. And so when the Oregonian called me for a statement about Mars Hill Church moving into town, just right off the cuff, I said, when they asked what I intended to do about it, I said, I intend to reach out and make friends. And that started a press shitstorm for all intents and purposes. I don't have a better word for it. It was almost immediate, the outcry from within the queer community. Like I was a traitor or something. But so that happened, and you know, that conversation was obviously amping up. It was front page news, and when that story came out, the next day, Tim Smith, who's the pastor at Mars Hill, actually reached out to me, and I don't think I thought they were going to. I think in saying that, I wanted partly to say to the Mars Hill people, look, you're in our town, and I see you. I see that you've arrived. And part of it was just because that's what I said in the moment. You know, it wasn't totally like a strategy. So they came over. You know, he called me and reached out, and we set up a time for he and I and some of his associates and some of my associates to get together, and they came to Q Center. These two, Mars Hill, the preacher and associate preacher, came to Q Center, which I didn't think was going to happen. Or you know, when they said they were going to come, I thought, how strange. Like, are they going to come picket us or burn down the building? Like, why are they coming here?
So it was early September of 2011, and I showed up for the first time to the Q Center and had a conversation with Logan and Barbara McCullough-Jones and some of the other staff here, and we had a very interesting conversation. I think none of us knew exactly what to expect when I walked in the door. I think everybody's kind of a little bit on eggshells. I know I was. I'm pretty sure everybody from the Q Center was. And we were slowly just kind of tentatively asking questions and trying to get to know one another a bit. And out of that conversation really came the desire to have more conversations. And that's really how this group, how this project, how this series of relationships came to be. It was out of that first conversation, which was a heart of, well, let's not just pass summary judgments on one another. Let's actually see what somebody actually thinks and feels, and some of their story and some of their experiences. And I felt, particularly when I came to the Q Center that day, the only thing that I knew that I needed to do coming through here was ask a lot of questions. I wanted to, and I genuinely wanted to know the folks that work here. I genuinely wanted to know about what the Q Center is and does. And that gave birth to a whole other series of conversations that grew and had implications that I don't think either Logan or I could have anticipated.
And during the course of that initial meeting, it became clear to everybody in the room that we needed to take this further. So we did, and we that first meeting was where the idea was born. And I called another meeting shortly after to talk to my colleagues here at Q Center about putting together a conversation group made up of queer people and community members from the fundamentalist evangelical church community. And that's how the whole thing started. I was drawn to the project because I created the project, and I created the project because I had seen it work in my own life with people that at one point wanted nothing to do with me, and over time, as they got to learn what it really meant to be gay and got to see my humanity and got to put it together that even though I had come out, I was still Logan. I was still their son, I was still their friend, still this person that they had gotten to know over the years. They changed their minds about me and my community and what it means to be gay. And so I wanted to see if we could recreate that on a larger scale.
I'm Dawn Menken. I'm a therapist, I'm a conflict resolution facilitator, and I've been the dean of an academic graduate program. I was the facilitator of this project, and what moved me were, I think the topic is an important one. Two polarized communities dealing with issues of the spirit and human dignity and love. Those are issues that are definitely important to me.
I think my relationship with the concept of God has evolved over the years. I was raised in a Christian cult, basically, very fundamentalist, anti-gay, and my dad was a preacher. I basically grew up in an environment where I was taught to really fear God or be afraid of who I was and how that related to God. And then when I was a teenager, I left. I came out. I realized I couldn't be in that environment. Came out. And my relationship to God turned into kind of non-existent. I think I rejected the whole concept of God and family and anything that had been affiliated with God before at that point. and I just went full into drugs and alcohol then for 16 years. And then when I came out of that, I think I had a different sense of God, right? Like I think I started thinking more like I was a part of something bigger. I don't know what that is, but I guess that's a long way of saying I'm agnostic. I have no idea.
You know, I grew up in a Christian home, and from a very young age, I identified with the church, with the Bible. My parents raised me to love and know Jesus, and I had an experience asking him to be in my life when I was pretty young, like 5 or 6, and from that point on, church and God have always been a part of my life. But for a lot of my life, it was a lot more about, it consisted, I guess, of a lot more of like religious things that I did. It was people I hung out with, places I would frequent, media that I consumed, programs and events that I was a part of. And over time, I came to see that those things might be part of my relationship with God, but it's something, an actual relationship with Jesus isn't necessarily the same thing as just participating in these things. And that for me happened later on in around high school for me. And that's when I would say for me, Jesus became more than just an idea that was talked about in church. It became more of a real person who called me into a real relationship with him. And so from that point on, I would say that I was a follower of Jesus, and that's always a dynamic process. And now I would use the word disciple. That's what a term the Bible uses a lot, which is another word for a follower, somebody who identifies with Jesus. And so my relationship with Jesus is one that comes to define me in the deepest way possible. And so if you were to ask, what's my relationship to God? My relationship to God is through Jesus, who has saved me, created me, and drawn me into a relationship with himself to where now he defines who I am.
My relationship to Christianity has also changed over the years, in that I was so angry for so long about my experience in that church, the Church of Christ, that just that word was re-traumatizing, you know. And my family was still very much a part of that church, which was painful. I was hurt more by the church, by the Christian church, than I ever have been by the world at large. So I went for years thinking all Christians are stupid, right? The blood of Jesus makes you clean and stupid. And now I feel a lot more compassion for Christians. And so I guess there's a little bit of respect there that wasn't there before for Christianity itself. Just having gotten to know some good Christians in the years since my very abusive experience in the church. And so I think I'm at a place with Christianity where I have learned to accept and respect them as well, up to the point that they start to take away my rights with their beliefs. That's when frankly, I think we've moved past Christianity and into, some other weird stuff.
So in light of all that, my relationship with Christianity is one where I identify myself as a follower of Jesus. Now, the interesting thing about interacting with the term Christianity is that Christianity can come to be a great many things. It could be considered by some to be a political ideology. It could, by others, to be a finite cultural construct as it exists maybe in the southern United States or things like this. But for me, if I were to say, what's my relationship, how would I define myself as a Christian? To me, a Christian is one who follows Jesus. And that can be worked out in anywhere in the world. amongst all kinds of cultures, from all kinds of perspectives. And so I would probably be one that would put less of a certain cultural baggage on that. But whenever you use the term Christianity, it can bring a ton of different things to mind. But for me, again, just in its essence, a Christian is a follower of Jesus, and Christianity is the movement overall of disciples, followers of Jesus Christ.
Organized religion never quite hit the spot for me, but I have always felt that I have been led by something divine, and it's important for me to be in contact with that spirit.
Sometimes I'm up, and sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord, sometimes to the ground. Sometimes I'm up, and sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord, sometimes to the ground.
So from that initial conversation that Logan and I had at the Q Center, Logan and I started corresponding on and off, and we're both busy guys, and so it took a while, but over time, an idea for a series of conversations with a very closely selected group of folks, both from Mars Hill and from the Q Center. This idea kind of slowly came together over time.
Well, I mean, I was so scared. You know, we had some meetings in between. There was this whole process of picking a facilitator. Tim and I really worked together from the beginning on the concept. I presented it to him. He thought it was sort of out there, but a good idea. And, you know, we started working together on who that would be and started assembling group members from our own communities. And there was a lot of trust there. You know, him trusting me that I wasn't doing it to, you know, I didn't have some ulterior motive to punish them or whatever, and on our end, me trusting that I wasn't leading myself into a slaughter, right? Me and my people, my lambs, we're going to go into the church and be slaughtered. So, you know, during the planning process, we were really clear about expectations, and the main expectation going in was that there would be no expectations. We're not trying to solve the history of hurt. We were really just seeing what it would be like in the midst of this polarized community reaction. We just wanted to see what it would be like to talk to each other and not be caricatures anymore, be humans.
And if I were asked the question, what did I think it would be like? I don't think I could have told you. I mean, I assumed that we would ask each other lots of questions. I assumed that we would have an opportunity to learn more about some people that we probably had some assumptions about. I assumed that some of those assumptions would probably be proved wrong. I assumed that it would be difficult and painful at times. And there was certainly at least some measure of anxiety around that. So I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I think there were some ideas of at least things that I hoped and thought would happen. But in terms of what that would actually feel like or be like, I really couldn't have known or anticipated that.
My goals shifted, I think, through the process. Starting out, like I said, I wanted to see if it was possible for people who are so different and from totally polar opposite worlds. I wanted to see what it would be like for us to talk about the conflict in a civilized way, and see if that was even possible. It was an experiment, you know, to see if we could find common ground.
I always have a goal in anything I do is I want to learn something. So learning is a goal, and also in my role as facilitator, to help facilitate the deeper processes an essence of what wanted to happen between those individuals who were participating.
You know, going in that initial time when we were asked to talk about our assumptions about the other side, I was pretty convinced that I wasn't under any assumptions. I was convinced that I knew who these people were, what they stood for, what they were against, and I was totally sure that they were against me and thought I was going to hell, and you know, that they were the problem and I was the solution on some level. So those weren't assumptions. That was I knew that. I knew who I was, I knew who these people were, and I knew that that they wanted me dead on some level. Well, I mean, those feelings about the evangelical community, certainly the fundamentalist Christian community, were developed by personal experience only. You know, that was by the many failures of all the adults who I came in contact with from the moment I was born until I was 14 and left. Every single person failed me, and so though that's all I knew. You know, of course I felt like these people were gonna be closed to the idea that I'm a human being, that queer love is also love, and if God is love, then queer love is also God. You know, those are things that I learned early on not to be true from the church leaders and the church I grew up with. So you know, I came by it honest. I'll say my prejudice against Christians came at the hands of them abusing me and proving to me that they were not to be trusted.
I would say going into this series of conversations and the relationships that have developed, when I look back, I think there were a lot more assumptions, a lot more caricatures, and a lot more ignorance on my part than I would have guessed going into this. Because if I'm honest, when I came into these relationships, I think that I believed, I'm not sure I would have said it this way, but I believed that any kind of homosexual desires were completely incompatible with being a follower of Jesus. I would have believed that repentance of sexual sin and real redemption, to use a biblical word, in someone's life who is living as a homosexual would mean not just a change in spiritual orientation, but also a change from being gay to straight. I think if I'm honest, I use the word gay as a descriptor and a metaphor and a joke in a condescending way. I think I was one who mocked and made more fun of LGBTQ, gay, whatever term you want to put on that, folks, in general. I think I was very passively dismissive in a lot of ways. I think I also primarily saw issues of homosexuality as primarily around simply a way to work out sexual attraction. And I would say at every one of the things I just said, I have been deeply convicted, I've been deeply challenged, and in many of them I've come to see things in a different way.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to know who was coming to the group and the deeper reasons why they were there. And I think one of the special things about this group is that the people who came really were there for the sake of genuinely wanting to learn about the other. And I think that's very different. They weren't there just to combat each other, but they were there to learn something. And I think the higher dream in the background is many people were hoping for a deeper reconciliation between two groups that have been antagonistically polarized.
My answers to those questions, those initial questions, why am I here? You know, I was there because I felt moved. I saw my community hurting. I saw a chance to reach out to people who they were being hurt by, and I felt like I had a sense of eldership in that situation, just having grown up in a church very similar. I knew who we were dealing with, or at least I thought I did. So that was my goal going in, was to try to expand their minds and be able to then plant a seed of change. You know, I definitely had that going in. I said I didn't have any goals, but I mean, obviously we all had goals going in. My goal was to change the world for the better, to make it safer for queer youth who might be in that church, who might be sitting in Tim Smith's pew, listening to how they're a cancer on society, and internalizing that like I had done many years before.
Collectively, we did not have any agreed upon set of goals for the group, and that was important for Logan and I. Beyond the overall goal that we would get to know one another more, that we would hear one another out, and that we would potentially be able to push past some caricatures we may have had of one another. And that was certainly all very close to my motivation for entering into this conversation and experience.
Well, I think we never speak about these stereotypes and assumptions. We have them, and particularly speaking about these two particular groups. The gay community, the LGBTQ community, carries an enormous amount of projection and stereotypes, but also people from the church community and evangelical groups also feel tremendously misunderstood, and that they're also stereotypes. So I wanted to break those up, and I wanted to give people the opportunity to actually face each other one-to-one and discuss some of those stereotypes. I mean, the first meeting, I want to say, was, as a facilitator, was quite extraordinary for me, because people took quite readily to sitting together in pairs and discussing really, really deep embedded stereotypes and assumptions about the other. Each side risked tremendously. And I remember one example in particular where one of the men from the Mars Hill Church, because I went over to the different dyads who were talking, and they shared with me, one of the members from the Mars Hill Church said he had never sat or spoken to a gay man before. This was his first time even speaking to a gay man. And it was revelatory to him when he said, he's just like me. That's another person who actually I have a lot in common with. And when he said that, the gay man who he was speaking with just broke down in tears. He said, you know, I have never been, ever in my life, I have never been perceived by someone from evangelical churches who have historically hurt me so much. They have never even seen me as a human being. And I mean, it was so amazing, the feeling between those two men, and that in itself was quite healing.
When it was time to pick our partner for that first conversation, it just, for me, it immediately I was drawn to Tara, because that's, she's a woman, and I'm a man. She's a lesbian, and I'm straight. And she's from a very different church tradition, while still being a professional minister. And so I'm like, well, that's pretty different. So it seems like I should talk to her. The experience of immediately being one-on-one for me, it wasn't, I certainly could have thought previously that would be awkward, but for me, I'm a very naturally inquisitive person, and I want to know everything about everything. And so for me, it in the moment, it wasn't particularly intimidating. It was more interesting, and I just remember asking Reverend Tara a lot of questions because I genuinely want to understand how she sees the world. I want to understand how she sees Jesus. I want to understand how she sees the Scripture and what it's like for her to be a pastor in a very unique circumstance.
Well, I hadn't been in a church up until that first meeting for the better part of 20 years. So it was hard. It was hard to get myself to walk through the door. I remember just as I parked, seeing the castle that is Mars Hill and feeling like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. And so just even the process of walking through church doors, having so deliberately exited many years before, and honestly never even considered going back, it was re-traumatizing in a way. But once I got through the doors and was greeted by very kind people, something shifted almost instantly. I think I had been carrying around a burden of the old church, my church that I grew up in, for years. And something happened as I went in there. I kind of set it down. I let them have it back. And so once I was in there and I sat down, the experience of being in Mars Hill was fine. I mean, it was tough because I think it was tough to be with the other side one-on-one so quickly because we didn't know each other, you know. I mean, so the point is to break the ice, right? That was the point of the exercise. But I was so scared of what lied beneath the ice that I wasn't sure I wanted to break it. You know, like I was like, who are these people and who am I in relation to this project? I was really going through it that first week. Like, what have I done? Why are we here? So yeah, I mean, that was what was going through my mind. I was afraid still.
Logan actually shared that he had not set foot in a church building in over 20 years, and just the feeling of just palpable anxiety for him was overwhelming and very difficult for him to come, which again was a good reminder for me. I'm so much in that world that I fail to realize sometimes how big a deal it is for sometimes someone to even just walk in the door of our church building. That was a powerful thing for me that has changed how I perceive people and how I interact with people, even on Sundays. It's given me a sensitivity to folks for whom it's like a life-altering step of faith simply to walk in the door.
It makes me think also just another piece at the end of that group. A gay man, another gay man and a man from Mars Hill Church who were speaking together, they shared afterwards in the larger group as we were coming together and sort of debriefing that exercise. And the gay man had spoken and revealed so much of his agony of being a young person who growing up feeling different and feeling ostracized and hurt and downed by the culture he was living in and by the family he had been living with. And the man from Mars Hill, he said, you know, I feel like I'm part of the problem. And I feel like I should repent. It was quite amazing. Imagine the atmosphere. We were in a church, and this man said, I feel like I need to repent and ask for forgiveness. And I encouraged him. since that was what he was feeling like he should do. And he apologized with great heart and feeling and said, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, and I've been part of that problem, and would you forgive me? And I think the gay man was he was taken aback, and at that moment, he was also extremely generous, and although there was much more to the story that would continue, was able to momentarily forgive, and the two men hugged. And did I expect that to happen at the first meeting? No way. That blew me away, that kind of an interaction could happen, and I think it inspired the whole group.
There was a number of things in that first conversation I remember that just stuck with me, but that was a huge thing for me. That really, really stuck with me. And it was deeply convicting to me as someone who had probably in one way or another, even though I would have never made that case theologically, that I'd probably done things that could have encouraged people to see themselves that way. And so for me, it was an important point, even initially for me, to walk away from that and prayerfully and biblically meditate on what I really think, what I really believe about this. And for me, it was an important time to clarify that all human beings, I believe, are created in the image of God with equal dignity, value, and worth. And I was deeply convicted that like, even from that first meeting, like, there's things I just can't say anymore. To say something that I think is lame or somehow flawed as gay, it's just wrong after that. And in that moment, it just hit me like I have contributed in a way that I didn't even realize to the dehumanizing of people who I believe are created in the image of God, regardless of behavior, regardless of feelings, regardless of lifestyle, regardless of anything. I believe that's the case for all human beings. And so even immediately from that very first meeting, I was convicted about ways that I have behaved, things that I have believed that were just wrong. Wrong according to who Jesus is, wrong according to Scripture.
Still nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah.
I think that first meeting, we were all sort of on best behavior, and the press cycle had been going, but it hadn't really amped up. But by the second meeting, when we met at Q Center, we had sort of, the email chain had been going back and forth. We had done a little bit more press. The community reaction to our getting together had started on the queer side. There had been a forum held at Process Work Institute between the queer community who thought we should be meeting with Mars Hill and the queer community who thought we absolutely were wasting our time, and how dare we. So there had been a lot of dialogue and a lot of movement in between meetings. I obviously felt more comfortable at Q Center because this is my safe space, right? So on the flip side of that, I also wanted to make sure that they all felt as comfortable as they had gone out of their way to make me feel when I had been at Mars Hill. It was very impactful, I think, the visual of having us go into their building and then having them come into ours. So I had a lot of feelings. As the meeting started, we were off our best behavior, and we really started peeling the layers off. Dawn really went in there, and she started talking about what we were so different around. And we, that's when the crying started, and it basically didn't stop till the end of the project. From that point on, it was difficult work, and that first Q Center meeting, I did have times where, you know, there was this one part where Tim said, I don't think homosexuality is any worse than any other sin. You know, and he equated it to, I think, adultery or lying or something. And I was sitting there with my partner next to me, who I deeply love and care about, and we're monogamous and have a very, you know, from what I can tell, a very nurturing, loving, regular relationship. So, you know, that was the first time where I decided to not be guarded and just kind of let them see how I was feeling. And I recall saying to him, you know, Tim, you and I are in these relationships, these long-term relationships, and at night, you know, if you were to commit adultery, you'd be in trouble, just as, like, if I were to commit adultery, I would be in trouble. We call it different things, but, you know, to be equating my love to adultery is twisted. And you know, the conversation went a little further, and I said, so at night, Tim, what you're saying is you get to lean over to your wife and kiss her goodnight. And what I have to do is lean over, kiss Alex goodnight, and then ask for forgiveness. Beg God not to send me to hell during the night for loving this person who loves me back. And I saw him think about that. That was the, you know, that was the first time where I felt like I was really heard in a way that challenged his beliefs. You know, like, oh yeah, that is offensive. You know, and for me to say lying is the same as your love, that's offensive. It's dehumanizing, right? We also went into the different terminology. I mean, it was like a cultural competency training on some level too for both sides. In that, you know, we didn't want them to be calling us the homosexuals or, you know, whatever was, you know, whatever intent was behind that. The terminology was hurtful. So, you know, we really dug in that second meeting, and it was hard for me because when the Mars Hillside were talking about their feelings, their beliefs in our safe space, in my queer center, in my safe space, I actually, you know, for the first time felt what some members of the queer community had been sort of screaming at me, which is, how dare you let these people in our house? How dare you let these people who've hurt us our entire lives into the queer center, which is my only safe space in the world, right? So I was challenged in that moment with those same questions, and I went in and out of having a grasp of why we had started this to begin with. You know, there were times where that second meeting, wished we hadn't, and felt like I had done something wrong. But then there were times where I just knew we were on the right track. So, which voice do you listen to, right?
For our second meeting, our first meeting, it felt like everybody was really giving their very best effort to find common ground. For our second meeting, that was less the case. And there was definitely more conflict. There was definitely more pain that was shared and more personal stories that were revealed in the middle of that conversation. And I remember it becoming at least somewhat heated at a few points. And yet it was interesting because still at the end of it, like, nobody stormed out. Nobody felt like they had to just escape as quickly as possible. I mean, well, at least they didn't, even if they felt that way. And there was still a sense to where we could hug or shake hands and say, you know, see you in a few weeks.
And there were many courageous individuals from the LGBTQ community who showed that pain and who cried about that pain and who are angry also and really showed the humanity of their suffering. And folks from the Mars Hill Church listened. And that was so unusual. That does not happen. That one group can really show its heart and its suffering, and that the other side deeply listens, and that they were affected, they were impacted by that. So I do remember that being essential. And at the same time, and this was a big learning, by the way, seeing the pain of the other. I think also the GLBTQ community had a little bit of a wake-up call to realize that even though Mars Hill seems more part of mainstream dominant culture in their views, they also suffer. And they suffer from the feeling of being seen as bigots and being called bigots in the media, in relationships, and in communities. And I think folks hadn't seen that before. And to feel for that and to hear members of Mars Hill Church saying, you know, just because I'm a Christian or just because I'm of an evangelical Christian, it hurts to be seen as a bigot. It hurts to be automatically assumed that I'm not a progressive person and that I'm not interested in learning more. So that was sharing and seeing each other's pain, I think, was a big part of that second meeting or third meeting. Yeah. I don't have much to say about the venues particularly, but what I can say around having two members of the GLBTQ community be ministers, and having also a pastor from the Mars Hill Church, broadened the view of Christianity. Other religions outside of Christianity did not really get much discussion at all. However, different experiences of God or spirituality did emerge. And I think having such a church presence created an openness for people to question in themselves, what is God? What is the divine? What is the Spirit? Is this important to me in my own life? And what is it like to be moved by God? And through these dialogues, I think it was apparent that for each person, that's really quite unique. And that could be, I mean, that could be a whole other dialogue. We didn't get into that piece as much as I actually would have liked to. What is it to be moved by the divine or by God in your life?
And it was, what was really cool about that was that the mind expansion that happened with all of us, you know, how the group sort of started talking in a way that was Christian versus gay. You know, it was really clear that that was too reductive. That was not really what we were dealing with. So MCC and being in that space together of the Metropolitan Community Church, being in a queer Christian space together, I think was good. You know, it helped the Christian side blend with the gay Christian side in a way that might not have happened otherwise.
And if you get there before I do, please tell my friends I'm coming too. And if you get there before I do, please tell my friends I'm coming too.
So spring is, in the life of the average year of Mars Hill Church, spring is the biggest time for us. We celebrate Easter as really like the Super Bowl of sorts in the life of an average year of Mars Hill Church. And it's that way for most Christians. Easter's a big deal. It's pretty consuming. Our church has grown very quickly, and there's only myself and one other person on staff, so it's grown very quickly with very little resources. It's really consuming, and we just finished this huge season, and I remember I was trying to get a couple days away up at Mount Hood, try to just get out of town and lay low for a little bit when I receive a phone call that a group of folks dressed in black with masks had broken a number of windows, thrown rocks through a whole bunch of windows in our building. And that on its own is certainly a thing. But then what took this much further is they wrote a letter, almost kind of a manifesto of sorts, that called me out, Logan out, Mars Hill out, Q Center out, and sent it to virtually every media outlet they could conceive of in the city of Portland. And so this act of vandalism, which is certainly a bit discouraging and disheartening on one hand, became quite a thing. It grew to much more prominence than it would have on its own. I gave more interviews than I can remember. Stories were syndicated out even nationally, as far as the Washington Post. Logan and I ended up on a local NPR program together to discuss it, and it was a very intense season. I think the whole experience of that particular vandalism did create a sense of additional closeness and connection within the group, as only kind of opposition can do. When you're trying to reach out and build relationships with somebody and that's opposed, it always creates a sense of, if you're in that because you believe it, because you believe in it, and because you believe it's an important thing to do, then it only strengthens that resolve. And I think that happened. It was certainly distracting. It took what was a series of conversations that had a lot more to do with some, at least to some extent, some theological ideas, as well as a lot of life stories, and plunged it into a series of current events that were a lot more practical. But it doesn't mean it wasn't a very real sense of a very real connection with one another as well.
11 vandals hit a Southeast Portland church early this morning, breaking several windows. In a press release, the Mars Hill Church said neighbors reported seeing several young adults in black masks throwing large rocks into the windows. In an email to KGW, the vandals wrote they targeted the church because of its stance against homosexuality. Late this afternoon, members of the Q Center and Metropolitan Community Church helped Mars Hill clean up.
Frankly, in my mind, it's kind of a hate crime. I think that word gets thrown around a lot, but you know, if you're persecuting someone for their beliefs, even if you don't agree with their beliefs, that, in my mind, is what that is.
Some of the stained glass windows that were broken were 100 years old.
I mean, the press part was the most difficult piece because, you know, Tim and I were enwrapped in this press. We basically got cast in these roles, right? Like, where I'm representing the gays and Tim is representing all Christians. And that's complicated because, you know, we were both representing ourselves and maybe our organizations. And then when the angry queer group threw the river rocks through Mars Hill windows and broke out their stained glass, and I went over and helped them clean it up, and the news was there, and I said on the news that this had been a hate crime. I mean, things just couldn't have gotten worse by way of coverage. It was so sensationalized that we had to kind of keep ourselves sequestered. Tim and I, the decision was made that Tim and I would be the only ones who talked to the press, and that was done in an effort to keep the project pure and maintain everybody's safety. I mean, it was dangerous. What we did was dangerous, and I think that became clear really early on. it was weird. It was weird to be the subject of such a shit show in the press. It was weird to be ostracized by my own community, to feel violence coming from within my own community. I was scared. You know, going in, I thought I was going to be scared of the Christians, which there was a little bit of that. You know, there are radicals and extremists in any community, and the queer community is no exception. So the extremists in my community reacted in a way that was trying to silence me, trying to shut down the project, trying to intimidate me, make me and my family scared enough that we would drop out or quiet down. And I think that's where the community underestimates me a little bit, or underestimated me and the rest of the participants. You know, we got into this not because I had gone rogue, but because we decided it was important. Me and Barbara and Paul and the rest of my colleagues here at Q Center thought and still think, in fact know, that this is an important piece, that going out into communities that would do us harm is an important piece of changing the world. I mean, I think the threats in some ways brought us together in that it was happening to us as a group, and so there was common ground that was found there within the experience, you know. But it did derail the project because there were times where, like the time where Tim and I got on the radio on OPB, and, you know, I felt like that would have been a perfect time for him to help me, for him as part of this group, for him to, knowing that I was under such attack, for him to not make it worse. And I felt like he did make it worse. So then we talked about that next meeting. You know, people had different experiences around all of that. People were all scared. So it was hard to talk about anything else there for a few months. And in some ways that was frustrating, and in other ways I think that was good, because it got to show, it got us down to a real human place. You know, we were all afraid together. We were all under attack, and that builds camaraderie in the strangest ways.
I mean, it was an awful incident, but it was also amazing. Why was it amazing? I mean, how could something so awful, such vandalism and the death threats that Logan had to endure, awful, awful. But what it did is it really highlighted the importance of what this particular group was doing, and that the group itself, I see them as cultural transformers, working on issues that are really important to all of us, and taking first steps. And when that vandalism did happen, and when the death threats began to happen, that actually brought the community together. People from the LGBTQ community who were part of our dialogues, they were some of the first ones to head over to the Mars Hill Church and help clean up the mess. We were all together in that. So I think it really, it brought us together in one vital point over and over, is that we're all against the violence of this particular issue, whether that be vandalism against property, whether that be teenage suicide with LGBTQ youth, and also some of the violent discourse that takes place between us.
Still nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. Well, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. Oh, glory, hallelujah.
Oh, I wanted to quit every day during the project. I wanted to quit. I asked myself countless times why I did this. Why on earth would I have done this? It was so hard. I mean, the whole thing was so hard. It totally consumed us. My life at work, my life at home. I felt absolutely regretful at times.
So, in answer to the question, was there a time when I thought I wanted to quit? I mean, at least on some level, it was like 48 hours before every meeting. But it was never like I was actually on the verge of not coming. It was just more like it's emotionally exhausting to wade into deep areas of pain and alienation with one another, especially with folks with whom you have some extremely deep fundamental disagreements that may or may not ever change. This is just a difficult thing. And yet I felt like it was worth it, and yet I was always, I felt like I had to continue with it. I feel like it was worth continuing with it, but was there certainly moments where there was a feeling of exhaustion or dread, to kind of, and the feeling that you have to like work yourself up to prepare to do it? Yeah, I'd be lying if I said that that wasn't the case. And I suspect that that would be the experience of a lot of the folks in the group, but I suppose I don't need to defend that either.
I absolutely took hits for my involvement. I might as well have been crucified, to use a Christian reference. They hated me. They still do. A lot of people still do. It severed relationships I had been building for years in the Portland queer community. It cast me in the role of bad guy somehow, traitor. There's some reaction from certain queer people to me and my involvement in my starting this project. The reaction was almost worse to me than it was to the Mars Hill community, or to Tim, in that they felt like I had switched teams somehow.
For the most part, it hasn't been a very personal attack against me, and just to be honest, a lot of other pastors and church leaders I'm friends with in Portland here have been fairly supportive and encouraging, and I've been able to take some of what I've learned from this and do teaching and even challenge some of their leadership teams in a couple different instances with what I've experienced and what some of my takeaways have been. And there's been a general sense of support from Mars Hill leadership as well in the midst of this.
If I could change one thing about the project, I'd try to keep the whole thing a secret. I would, obviously it started in the press, so that wasn't an option for us, but if I could craft this whole thing in a new scenario, I would leave out the press entirely. I would leave out both of our communities, and I would let this film be the first anybody heard about it.
If we had the whole thing to do over again, I would have liked to get into some more biblical and theological issues. I love that. It's what I do. And especially since we had a few church leaders from a very different perspective than I have, I would have liked to get more specific on some of that than we did, although we did get into quite a bit of that.
In my mind, the success was always going to be determined by whether or not we could get together and talk, and we were successful at that. That was the goal, was to get together and talk, not to change each other's minds. We didn't have any grand scheme other than to see if we could work on something together. And I think that the conversations were successful in that way. I think relationships were built that will be lasting. And I think this film that we're making is sort of points to that, right? Like, not only are we in each other's spaces and willing to be in each other's spaces on film, but we're also making this movie together.
Was it successful? I would say yes. Because what we set out to do was get to know one another more and be challenged by that. We came to develop more relationships, and we absolutely did. And I think everyone in the group was challenged. I think everyone was affected in some way. I think everyone was moved to consider some things that they hadn't been moved to consider before. I know I was, and I'm pretty confident that everyone would express that in at least even a small way.
But I think the biggest changes that happen for people are inside of themselves, internally, in their relationships, and how they relate to groups who are different than they are. Those are real changes, and I think those are the most powerful, because without those changes, you really can't make systemic changes.
What real change has come from this group? Each person's going to have their own answer to that. I don't think we certainly changed the city or anything on a really broad basis, but I can just say personally, I was certainly changed by the process. And as I've said previously, it forced me to ask questions that if I could have avoided, I probably would have liked to. I think that it forced me to come to positions on things that were really key that I don't know how I would have come to apart from that. It's changed my sensitivity to others. It's changed how I hear and listen to other people's stories. It's changed words that I use, language that I employ, both privately and very publicly. It's changed the way I see and speak to my church. And I was asked at one point in an interview this very question, like, based on this, how would you speak to someone who may come to you and have just kind of come out, maybe to their parents or to their family or to their community or something like that in your church? What would you do differently now? In the same way as I've shared at length at other times in this conversation, I think there was a time in which I would have said, I would have discussed this a lot more on the levels of desires. Now I would take it a lot more to a place of identity. And I would communicate to them that their desires don't inherently put them at odds with God. I would communicate to them that they have equal dignity and value and worth as a human being. I would communicate to them that anyone who sought to denigrate them, bully them, somehow assert that they were less human in any way, shape, or form because of who they feel attracted to is contrary to what I believe is the Word of God and certainly the way that Jesus handled himself with others.
I learned that we aren't that different. You know, we actually aren't that different. And I am them, and they are me. And that's just how this whole world works. And so, in knowing that, in that feeling of like, you're me, it's hard to hate somebody once you realize that. You know, it's a little bit different then it's more about you and looking at you and figuring out what is it about this person that I hate about myself, and going deeper and deeper into that until you get to a place where you're changed and the world is different.
One of the biggest learnings, I think, that I would bring out, or a place where I feel that we ended, was in, and this might sound simplistic, but I think it's quite deep, which is to feel the other, and particularly to feel the suffering of the other. Now, it looked different in each group, but both groups were suffering at the point of change. For example, Mars Hill, after listening to the pain of the LGBTQ community, meeting them as individuals, having their stereotypes be busted up, liking people, finding yourself, oh my goodness, I like that person. And then hearing how their viewpoint the scriptural viewpoint is hurtful to the GLBTQ community, I felt that they were suffering over that, holding the tension for the Mars Hill group to hold the tension of, oh my goodness, I like this group, I like these individuals, and yet I'm part of a faith that sees their behavior as sinful. For the GLBTQ community, they felt the same. Here they were, sitting with a group of people who they felt have been antagonistic to them, and they were liking them too. How do you hold that polarity of liking people who you have felt have discriminated against you, have kicked you out of their church, have disowned you, have pathologized your behavior, and yet they're sitting there and they feel like, I like this person. Suffering over that polarity, that duality. Both groups shared that at the end. And I think that's the point of growth and change. And what happens next, I can't say.
If there's one thing I would challenge people to in response to the relationships that were built and this experience that we had together, it'd be this: I see a trend in the world. Maybe it's always been this way, but I certainly see it very prominently in our current day. There's a strong trend to towards polarization of everything, and in that, I think that most of the time Christians tend to adopt a posture of either conformity or dismissal. So that means that you either need to completely passively dismiss whole people groups, whether it's queer community or whatever, or if you are going to wade into the waters of relationship with others who you might not agree with, then you have to completely conform and come to take on a position of complete agreement, and that there's no room in between. It's these opposites of hate or total acceptance, and I just reject that. I absolutely reject that, and I reject that because Jesus is my hero, and he rejects that. And Jesus had a profound way of aligning himself relationally with folks, while still not compromising even in the slightest, of presenting himself as God, relationship through him as the only way to salvation, and the right response to that relationship being repentance. And so for me, I would challenge folks, for me it's all about Jesus. For me, I'm convicted that I was too far on the dismissive end. Because I felt like if I even waded into the water, I'd get swept away in conformity. And that just shows that I didn't have a lot of faith in even the God that I claim to worship. That's just lame. And so what I would challenge Christians to is that if your God is big enough, and if the word that you claim to follow is true enough, there should be no conflict with actually getting to know people and wading into that. And that doesn't mean you have to change every position that you have. And at the end of the day, what I'm after, what I want to point everyone towards, is simply relationship with Jesus. I follow his example. That's why I came to the Q Center that day. That's why I pursued these relationships. That's why I pray for the folks that are that I came to know and care for in the midst of this, and that's my prayer for the whole city of Portland and everyone I come in contact with.
My single most impactful moment for me of our meeting together was feeling like we made it through. You know, there were times that were so hopeless and so hard, but feeling like at the end we did this, we did it together, we're still all here. No one really got hurt other than, you know, fear, and none of us got killed, and that, you know, if each of us touches 1,000 people in our lifetime, and each of those people touches 1,000 in theirs, we've made a real impact already. Even if nobody in the world sees this, or even if this film wasn't happening, the fact that we came together amidst our difference, our vast differences, is touching. And I've been able to use this experience in other parts of my life where conflict exists, and it's totally changed my view about opposition and how we handle that and how we move forward as a community.
The single most impactful moment of all of this came at the end of the NPR interview with Logan and myself. And after me giving, in retrospect, what I feel like were some okay but pretty clunky answers in a few ways, because I was so overwhelmed, the host turned to Logan and said, final question, Logan, do you think Tim loves you? And Logan was surprised by that question. So was I. It's not the question either one of us were anticipating. But he said, at least as I remember what he said, you know, as a friend, I believe Tim genuinely cares for me and wants good for me, and yeah, I do. I think he loves me, and whatever happens with Logan and I, like, there was an article that came out around that time, the Mercury. I think the title of the article in the Mercury was "The Odd Couple." I don't know what the future is for the odd couple of Logan and I, but I know I made a friend. I know I care for Logan, and the fact that that on at least some level he feels the same way, to me, is worth any number of broken windows or difficult circumstances or hard conversations. Because at the end of the day, that's what I'm here for. I want people to know that, to know us and to know Jesus. I want them to know that we love them and Jesus loves them. And at the core of what we're doing here at Mars Hill Church, Portland, that's what we're about. And so that even in a small way, Logan came to feel that from me, makes everything else that happened, I think, worth it.
If I could download one thing to the world about this project, the thing I learned most on repeat throughout the project was that what I think I know about myself or about God or the world or other people's beliefs or Christianity or the Mars Hill Church or Q Center or the queer community, you know, the list goes on and on. But the one thing I learned over and over was that what I think I know, I don't actually know. You know, there was one time where at the beginning of this, we were on the radio, and the question was asked to Tim, what would you say to an LGBTQ youth who had come to you, had come out and was scared to tell his parents, or, you know, whatever the story was. And his answer at that point was he would talk to them about how we as people are more than our sexuality, right? And then I asked him on the last meeting how he would answer that today. And his answer was so involved and so thoughtful and so different, you know, and I just felt like we had really done something. Felt like I saw myself in that pew in his church, and I saw a younger version of me being held up as a human in that church and saved in a way that none of them think they can do. It has nothing to do with saving somebody's soul, like saving a life in this world. And I watched this man change, and I happy to have played a part in that.
And the deepest need, the deepest underneath revenge is the feeling that you are going to feel what I feel. You're going to feel the kind of pain that I have suffered finally. And that somehow we will actually see each other. People usually don't get to that bottom point, but they find that when they do lash out in vengeance, then what? Then what? Nothing. So you gave someone a smash back, you hurt someone else. Did that really help you? No. Yeah. But the need to be seen and felt by the other who has been your enemy, that's profound.
I was alive before I was alive. I was alive before I was alive. And I held your love before you had arrived. I knew you long before, in another time, when I was alive before I was alive. I was alive before I was alive. And you were my love before, long before this time. You were my heart before I was alive. But I was alive before I was alive. We were around before